on? Can you guys hear music?
No.
No.
All right, everything's failing all at once. All right. But you can hear me.
I can hear your voice.
Okay, and I can hear your voices. Guys on the chat, can you hear Greg? Can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear. I don't know. Weird. Okay. And that's not connected at all. Why is that not connected at all? All right, we're going to get rid of that. All right. Sorry, guys. For some reason, I am facing multiple technical problems. But you can't sound with no picture. Yes, I know that. Yes, but no music. I now know that as well. The question is, can you hear Greg? Could you hear Greg? Greg, say something.
1, 2.
All right, let me know if you can hear Greg. All right, let me just delete this. Delete. Okay, that's taken care of. This is here. All right. Sorry, everybody. For some reason, video has decided not to work. And the chat software has decided not to work. And everything's falling apart here. I'll have to spend the morning fixing it. But anyway, this is the Yaron Book Show. Thanks for joining me. I have on today Greg Salmieri. We've got an Amish Adulja, and we're going to be talking about a conference workshop. I mean, you guys helped me define this, that they're going to be hosting this next weekend. We're going to talk about the theme of the workshop is desocialized medicine. And then I think Amish has about 20 minutes, and he's going to drop off at some point. And Greg and I are going to stick around and talk about all kinds of stuff. And of course, a lot of what we talk about will be dependent on what you guys want us to talk about, because you'll get to dictate that through the questions that you ask. So let's get this rolling. I don't know which one of you wants to start, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the workshop?
Yeah, so this workshop has grown out of a group that I started when I started at the Salem Center. I got an online discussion group called the Thomas Hendricks Working Group after the Doctor and Atlas Shrugged. And it's a group of philosophers, intellectuals, and people in the medical field who are thinking about medical freedom, why we need it, why we don't have it, what it would take to get it. And it was something I was really keen to start when I started this position, because I just happened to know a concentration of really bright, qualified people in the field, first among them Amish Adulja, who's on with us, and some others as well, and some others I met actually through talking about this on your show. So we've been talking about these issues on and off in phone groups and Zoom sessions for a few years now, and wanting to have a conference for a few years, but the time wasn't right because of COVID and other things. And so we're getting together for a public conference. It's also going to be live streamed. If you're in Austin, you can come. Sorry, it'll be streamed to YouTube, or if you're in Austin, you can come and see it live on Saturday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. to talk about desocializing American medicine, what it looks like to advocate for freedom in medicine, why we need it, and so forth. Amish, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important is that lots of people in this community have spoken about issues in medicine and socialized medicine and national healthcare and single payer, but I think they don't really quite understand the history of that movement, where it comes from, what the opposition has been, and what it's like today in terms of where is government involved in medicine and where isn't it. It's more where it's almost universally involved in government. And I think government is universally involved in healthcare. And I think that's something that I think needs to be concretized, because a lot of people were up in arms about Obamacare, but they weren't about Medicare Part D, the prescription drug benefit, or any of the other programs that you face. And I think they think of Obamacare as a turning point, but it really wasn't a turning point. It really was just more of the same. And I think being clear on what it's like to practice medicine in all the places where government kind of abuts medicine and constrains or restricts or has this regulatory influence on how a person practices is really important, because then it actually lets you see, where are there glimmers of hope? Where is there places where you could make nudges towards the right reforms? And I think that's part of the goal here, is to really be clear on what it's like in terms of the government intervention in the healthcare industry at this point.
Yes, a theme of the whole conference is that socialized medicine or collectivized government or government medicine isn't some future threat or bogeyman that we have to fight off, or something that exists in some other places but not here. It's something we've been living with in one form or another for many decades, most significantly since Medicare passed in the 60s, but there were forms of it before then, and it's grown continually since. And we want to understand socialized medicine as not some evil to be avoided in the future, but a present destructive force that can be fought. We need to desocialize it, and we need to first understand what it is. And so a theme that we've had throughout our working group, and why it's called the Thomas Hendricks Group, after the character in Atlas Shrugged, is we really wanted to focus on the fact that medicine is a product. It's produced by reasoning minds, by people who need freedom to do that. And everybody who's working in the medical industry and everybody who's a customer of that industry is operating in this sphere of their life under force that's kind of incompatible with the kind of valuing and thinking that is necessary for human flourishing and for people to produce their best work, to create new values, and to be discerning about what values they want to consume. So we want to take the conference to kind of spell out the ways in which this force is operative, what the nature of the evil is, how it's destructive, and then think about solutions. And so the structure is, I'm going to start with a talk on the general themes. It's called Liberating the Medical Mind. Then Amish is going to give a talk on the history of government involvement in American medicine. What are the rationales for it at different times? What are the ways that it's grown over the years? What is the nature of the system that we're living under? And then we're going to spend a lot of time on panels with different people from different parts of the healthcare industry, talking about what it's like to practice medicine today, what are some of the challenges, and what are some of the solutions they have in mind for them that are first step solutions. The ultimate solution, of course, is to bring freedom to this field, to have a separation of government and medicine in the way we need a separation of government from every part of the economy. But what are first steps in that direction that would redress some of the most pressing problems? So we have a panel on the doctor-client relationship from that point of view, and a panel on decontrolling healthcare. And then we're going to close with a talk by Don Watkins on how to desocialize medicine, the kind of moral framing of the issue we need to have a movement around this.
Can you tell us a little bit about kind of who are the people on the panels?
Yes.
Who you've invited to the conference?
I'll name them in Amish. You can, because I have the list in front of me, and Amish, you can comment, because a lot of this was done with Amish's help, finding people, finding the group, and he has had a lot of insight into who would be good for it. But Art Astorino, who led up Americans for Free Choice in Medicine in the 90s and did a lot of the fighting against Hillary Care, as it was at the time. Michael Cannon, who is an analyst at Cato. Michael Garrett, who's a concierge physician here in Austin. Richard Parker, and Amish, you could talk about his history in this because you've found him for us.
So Richard Parker is an emergency medicine physician in Texas who has kind of been around the objectivist movement for some time and used to host a lot of email groups talking about the philosophy of medicine, and I think really has a lot of great insight into the evolution of American medicine and how hard it's become to be kind of a solo doctor trying to avoid that aspect of those aspects of medicine.
I'll mention some others. Michael Kaufman, who has been involved in some ARI events. He's on the board of some pharmaceutical companies and has done a lot of work in pharma. Jared Rhodes, Jared Seehofer, who is the CEO of a company working to deal with the help shepherd product through FDA approval. Jared Rhodes is involved in a group that's trying to shape medical policy or educate people about it. And Colleen Smith, who's a attending an ER physician in New York. One of the things that I think this list reveals, and there were more people that we couldn't get just because of logistics, really well-placed people in the medical industry, very knowledgeable people. There's a lot of people now who really know Objectivism well, who have been trained by ARI's programs, who have just been in the community for many, many years, who are really bright, thoughtful people about applying this philosophy to their life and careers, and who are now quite far along in careers in medicine, who are highly placed, who are very knowledgeable. And I found talking to all of these people tremendously enlightening. I've learned a lot, and I think they've learned a lot from talking to one another. And this is a chance to bring some of those discussions to the public.
There hasn't really been this kind of there hasn't really been this kind of an organization around medicine for some time. There was a lot of activity around the time of the Clinton administration and the Clinton care issues. And I think this is an opportunity to really bring some firepower to the medical field with the ideas that are in this community, and to organize it in a way that people can exchange those ideas, and we can actually come up with actionable, concrete things to work on.
Are there also non-objectivists attending or participating?
Well, of the speakers, I think Michael Cannon isn't an objectivist, or wouldn't think of himself as from Cato. Yeah. But all the other speakers are, and that was on purpose. I mean, I want to kind of present a certain line on not just that socialized medicine is wrong, not just that we have a form of it, but what's wrong about it. And I wanted people who would have some of the kind of insights into that come out of having thought about this from the perspective of objectivism. And there are now a lot of such people in the world. But I'm hoping that the audience for it will be a lot wider than that, and that will have more influence on people both here who come and hopefully on the live stream. And of course, it'll be available to watch on the Salem Center's channel thereafter.
So how do people find out more about this? I mean, is maybe somebody can put on the chat, put on the chat on Zoom.
Okay.
The URL, and I will put it.
Where is?
I will put it on the chat in the.
Trying to get the chat open.
Yeah.
Ray, are you doing that?
Yeah, I've got it already. Yep.
Okay. Good.
So anybody can come.
Anybody can come on Saturday. It's open. There's programming from 10 to 6. Anybody can come in person. There'll be lunch served. And we're also going to have a kind of more closed door session on the Sunday to sort of reflect on it and think about next steps forward. But the Saturday programs are public programs, and we're hoping we'll get a nice turnout for them.
Yeah, one thing I think it's important.
Yeah,
go ahead. I was going to say, one thing that I think it's really important just for your audience or anybody thinking about these topics is, why is medicine different than other parts of your life and the values you pursue? Why do people treat it differently? Why is it something where there's always been government involvement? Why is it seen as different as you buying a computer or you buying a car? And I think that's something that the group that we've assembled here is really going to have kind of, I don't want to give away everything, but kind of acute insights into that are a lot different than the mainstream. Because what you'll know is when you think about the fighting that people have over healthcare, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, the American Medical Association, they're all agreeing on the fundamentals. They all think of it. They all think of medicine different than everything else. They just argue a little bit about some of who's in power, who's not in power, whose reimbursements are higher or lower. They don't actually think about medicine as a commodity. They and I think that's something that's going to come out in this conference that I think is unique about other conferences or other groups that have tried to kind of incrementally stop some of the government intrusion into medicine. They're not doing it in a wholesale manner. They're really just kind of arguing over little details that don't really matter in the end.
And I think even the more libertarian commentators who might be more alert to the economic aspects of it and who might think of medicine more as a product, which of course it is, don't have the moral framing that we're going to bring to it. So medicine is an achievement of the human mind. And it requires thought at every level, on the thought of the patients, on the thought of the doctors, very importantly, on the parts of all the business people involved. There are business models involved here, as an insurance company, as a private practitioner doctor, as a hospital, as a lot of other things that haven't ever come into existence because nobody's been free to do them. And we want to think about all of that kind of thought that goes into formulating products and formulating values. What premises are at large in our society that prevents us from leaving people free to do that? And what are the effects of that on all of our lives?
Yeah, so PB, one of the listeners here says, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I can tell you it's nearly impossible to make a living without relinquishing all control to largely socialized hospital systems. Most of my patients have no idea how bad it is.
Amish, this is a topic you've really brought to my attention. The difficulty of functioning outside of the system, why it's only available to people in certain professions. And it's something we're going to talk about on one of the panels. But do you want to say a little about it now?
Yeah, so there has been this burgeoning movement for concierge medicine and direct primary care and paying cash. But you have to recognize that that's only done by permission, and only for very certain specialties is it actually viable, because of the way Medicare's regulations are, you cannot charge a Medicare patient, even if they're not, even if they've opted out or they're not doing Medicare, they're coming to you for cash payment. You cannot charge them anything different than what you would charge a Medicare patient. So what ends up happening is you end up restricting who can actually use any of those more free market types of medical care. And if you're a specialist that needs to be in a hospital and work in a hospital situation, it's impossible, because almost all hospitals are going to be taking Medicare dollars. And if you take Medicare dollars, that comes with strings attached. So what they've done is that, yes, there are these little slivers, but it's nearly impossible for that to work outside of maybe primary care doctors, pediatricians, psychiatrists, bariatric surgeons, plastic surgeons, dermatologists. It's not something that I, as an infectious disease doctor or a critical care doctor, could even come close to having a parallel system. It's just not viable with the way Medicare has crowded out and has controlled all of medicine, and has since the 1960s.
And one of the things that we're going to talk about is what would be some of the smallest incremental changes that could be made that would start to liberate up that area of medicine, and move us towards a system where doctors aren't so isolated from their patients financially, where there's more shopping going on, where there's more thinking about the value of procedures, and more of the kind of respect that comes with a trade relationship, rather than a relationship where medicine is doled out to one as one's pittance, which is what we have now.
Wes writes, I work with healthcare data. Any thoughts on HIPAA regulations and how such rules limit progress and innovation? I think clearer laws on property rights related to data would improve things.
Well, I definitely think
thoughts on HIPAA?
Well, I think so. HIPAA has many different facets to it, but one of it is that people want their health data to be private, and I understand that. But what's happening is that so many innovations get blocked because that law, or as it's interpreted, is very constraining, or how lawyers in hospital systems or healthcare systems interpret it is very constraining. And I think to see the full revolution with artificial intelligence and machine learning and all these big data analytics, you're going to have to make sure that HIPAA is not inadvertently stopping that from happening, because there's so much out there that we could learn about people on a population level, genomics. All of that is going to require a lot of data crunching. So HIPAA has to be something that's not seen as an obstacle. And unfortunately, it often is seen as an obstacle, or it becomes an obstacle because of ambiguity in how things are interpreted, and because of lawsuits, and because of how the government penalizes people for certain data. So that has to be part of the discussion of how we move to 21st century medicine, by modernizing some of those laws, which may have actual purposes. HIPAA does have real legitimate purposes, but I think we want to make sure that it's actually as narrowly constrained as it is, so it doesn't actually end up harming what could actually benefit all of us in the future.
Yeah, it strikes me that there has to be a revolution in terms of how we treat data, personal data anyway, because I mean, healthcare is just one aspect of this, but there's everywhere we look, our data is being used, and there's a lot of ambiguity about how it's being used, what it means.
One of the kind of central themes in my thinking about this, and in my thinking about a lot of issues in politics lately, is that there are a lot of areas that need fresh thought, and they need fresh thought every generation as new technologies develop, as new business models develop, as new ways of interacting develop. And we want to be sure that we have the kind of society that's free for people to do that thinking, to come up with new ways of interacting, and then to make money from doing it. Because you can't do that thought, you can't do that experimentation if it has to be a sacrifice to do it, or if you're not ever allowed to implement it. And so there's a lot we don't know. And what does it mean to have the freedom to do that work? Well, one, you have to not be in a system that's so regulated that you don't have options. And two, you have to have rights to property protected. In that case, the property might be data. And what we need to think about is what are the right kind of contractual relationships concerning data? What are the property rights in data? And I think we need to think about that for a number of different reasons concerned with privacy. And what's the general framework that needs to be worked out around those things that would allow people to create and own what they create?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because we have no ability to predict what markets will actually come up with, what people will actually invent and think of in terms of solutions to these problems. And it's the freedom to allow people to come up with those solutions and then test them out in the marketplace is what we're looking for. All right, so people can register, if they're there, can they ask questions? I mean, is it going to be interactive?
Yes, it's going to be, there's going to be
for those online as well.
I don't think it'll be interactive for those online. We don't have the setup for that. It'll be streamed and people can watch it, and maybe someone will call out a question to us if they're watching on their phone. But basically, there'll be questions from the audience. The panels will involve a Q&A as well as the talks, but it'll basically be, I think, a mostly spectator experience if you're online, a more interactive if you're in person. Again, I'm hoping people will come and join us there. And I'm hoping this will also live on the internet as a resource.
Great. Anything else, Amish, on the conference?
No, I think that hopefully this is again the start of something really that will continue on and lead to further discussions and actually a movement to fix some of these problems and to set the framing correct. So I hope that people find it of interest and that, as I said, that we keep the momentum going after this conference.
Yeah, part of what we're trying to do here is seed or maybe reboot an objectivist-oriented medical freedom movement. And I think we're well situated to do that. Again, we have a lot of expertise in medicine, a lot of expertise in the field of medicine, and every that is in the business of medicine as well as in as actual doctors. Every time I do an appearance or I'm on this show, someone reaches out. We just had someone in the chat who's interested, and if anybody wants to get in touch, please reach out to me or to Amish. And we have a few younger people who are really interested in doing this kind of work going forward. Reinierschuur, who is helping me to organize the conference and who's online with us, is now, I think, a junior fellow at ARI, or just started there, and wants to pursue this line of inquiry, working on medical policy. He's going to be hosting serving as the kind of interviewer or moderator for the panels. We have a young woman who's gone through the OAC who's working in a position on these issues at Cato. I'm not sure if I should be naming everybody, but who's also going to be at the conference and participating. So and again, there's a network of people already. So I'm hoping we're in a position to share ideas, to start things going, and to bring a particular frame of thinking about force and freedom to an issue where it's really important for all of our lives.
Do you expect to start an organization around this like they used to be?
We already have this discussion group that's sort of informally doing it. Americans for Free Choice in Medicine, I believe, still exists as an organization, although it's not very active, and I'm hoping this will lead to a reboot of it. But that'll have to be more in the hands of some of the others than me. I'm just setting the framing for it.
Yep.
Americans for Free Choice in Medicine still does exist. They have a website. I'm actually on the board of Americans for Free Choice in Medicine. It's just not as active as it once was. And I think there is an opportunity to rejuvenate its activities as well with this group.
Good. Well, the orthopedic surgeon who wrote on here definitely wants to get in touch with you guys. Is there a way to get in touch with?
You can reach me at gsalmieri@gmail.com, or you want to Ray's given his email address. Maybe reach out to Ray.
Yeah, I can give him Ray's email address for now. And so PB, write to this email address that I'm posting in the chat, or anybody can write to that. And if you want to get involved in some way, this is Ray's email address, and then he will forward your email to the relevant people and provide you with information. And I will put the link to the event and Ray's email in the description below after the show. I'll add it to the description as well.
Great.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Amish.
All right. I'm going to log off.
Thanks, Ray. Appreciate it. And Greg is going to stick around, and we're going to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, but also, kind of what I want to talk about, which is, so the show, I was telling Greg this earlier, or emailed him earlier and said the show I wanted to do today, but I didn't know if I had an answer to it. So I was dreading actually doing it, is there any hope? And this comes, of course, following my show yesterday on Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And just everything that's been happening since October 7th, on top of everything that's happening in the world beyond October 7th, Ukraine and everything else. But October 7th in many ways, I don't know how you think about this, Greg, but it brought home so many of the issues that we're facing, and more the response, right? So the action itself was not surprising, although it was in the sense of Israel's failure to stop it, but it wasn't surprising in the sense of the brutality. But it's the response in the world, particularly by the masses, not so much by the politicians, but more by the people out in the street, that has really been quite shocking. The extent of it, again, not too surprising, but still, you'd think that what happened on that day is so repulsive that they would at least hesitate. But it seems like from day one they were out there. So, yeah, what you think about that, and then we can get to is there hope?
I mean, mainstream American politicians have said the things you would expect them to say that have been not inspiring, but what you would expect and finish, and have some element of moral resolve and horror at what happened. And so that's as you would expect. And you would expect there to be a fringe of hard leftist professors and other nihilist sorts among libertarians and others who would, in effect, take the Hamas side. But the number of people on the streets, how widespread this is, the protests on campus, the levels of them, how many people in England just the other day, that is not 180 from what I expected, but it's larger than I expected.
Yep.
And it's really disheartening.
Yeah, it's I think particularly on universities, I guess there's a sense in which we should have expected it, given the left's dominance and given the nihilistic nature of the modern left. It's still shocking to actually see it, and it's shocking to see it related to such horrors in real life. That is, these people can be stupid when they're abstract and when they're talking about general ideas, and maybe when they're canceling Joe and Schmo and whatever over minor trivial things, but to defend rapists and murderers and butchers and just the butchery of Hamas, and defend a system that so treats women the way it does, and a system that treats gays the way they do. You would think just the concrete horror of it would hold them back, but it doesn't.
And how well developed or well entrenched the anti-Israel narrative is, so that it's not, it's complicated and things are difficult and whatever, which is, I think, what most people probably think who have some hesitations about Israel's defending itself. But Israel's an apartheid state; it's illegitimate. It's the level of how widespread and entrenched this narrative is, and it's a narrative that I think is tremendously unjust and not founded in facts, and that I knew was around, but just how thick on the ground it is among young people is concerning. I should say, it's just as someone reporting from a campus.
Yeah.
there's always been a Palestinian students group that was out from time to time with their posters and so forth. I saw that last year. I know there have been more activities on Texas's campus. There was a protest the other day, and some things reported in the newspaper, and it's troubling. But it's not like I myself have not encountered very much going on campus. Just walking around campus, I encounter it much more in other circles that I go. When I go to play music with people, how many people are at a park where I play music at? There were some people with, not Hamas, but Palestinian solidarity shirts right after 10/7, when it's surprising, the kind of Facebook and other posts I see from people and what I see on the internet generally is larger than what I see in real life, enough so that I would think that the world isn't Twitter and you can be too online, if not for the fact there are hundreds of thousands of people in London and other places.
Yes, I mean there is the risk of be caught up in kind of the bubble within social media that emphasizes outrage and emphasizes the most radical and crazy stuff going on, and
the scale of the London protest speaks for itself.
The scale of
the London gathering speaks for itself.
Yes, and pictures we saw on Veterans Day in New York and in other cities, and taking down American flags during Veterans Day. I mean, it just the evidence is accumulating that this is not a trivial. It's still likely a small minority, and should that make us feel any better about what is going on?
Well, it depends how the rest of the country reacts to it. And I think that still remains to be seen. I think most people are taken aback by this, are horrified by it. And the more that the people that are protesting in favor of solidarity with the Palestinians, the less they distance themselves from Hamas, the more they chant from the river to the sea, the more there are these episodes of tearing down the flyers of the hostages and the children. The more we see of this, the more I think we're going to see and are seeing a rejection of this movement. But what is that rejection going to look like? And who are going to be the voices and spokespeople of it? And I think there's an opportunity for some real sanity here. But there's also opportunities for other kinds of reactions. And we'll see. I mean, we'll see who comes to the fore. There have been some really excellent voices. You've mentioned Sam Harris, who's been fantastic on this. Barry Weiss has been really good on this. David Deutsch. So which of these kinds of people are going to be the avatars for this, including in politics? Who's going to arise as representing the political parties on this? What are our candidates going to say about it?
Yeah, well, we did see in England, at least in the UK, the one minister in the British government that actually spoke out against the demonstrations and called them what they were was fired this morning. So we certainly see that the politicians in England are cowering before these masses. The police seem to be cowering over there, which is worrisome. I don't think we've reached those levels in the US, although I didn't see many police out when these people were trying to tear down the doors. But we saw the same thing in BLM. I mean, BLM burnt down whole parts of cities and the police did very little.
Yeah, I mean, this is not to excuse that, but how to police a riot, particularly or a mob, particularly when part of what is fomenting the mob is a kind of anti-police, anti-establishment sentiment, is a difficult question. I don't know how to do it well. And I think a big part of how to do it well is not to let those kind of mobs gather in the first place. The idea that every thoroughfare is a place for people to voice their opinions in whatever number is not what the right to freedom of speech or freedom of assembly means. There's a really excellent talk on this by Ankar Gate that he gave here at Texas from a few years ago. So one of the issues is there's something unsafe about these kinds of protests at this scale on public property, whatever their alleged cause is. And once you have them, police are in danger if they're trying to break them up. They're in danger if they're not. It's just not, you have kind of fire in a bottle and it's hard to control it.
Yep, definitely. So I've talked about this. Somebody actually has a question about this. Where is it? Yes. What did you think about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's essay? So I did a whole show yesterday about it, but so I'll assume the question is referring to you. So, I mean, that's one response. I think Ayaan is certainly responding to some extent to what's going on right now in stating that she's no longer an atheist and is now a Christian.
I mean, she's been on this trajectory for some time. I think she's been keeping company with more and more conventional and less intellectual sorts. And I think her husband is an example of that. He's a kind of intellectual in a way, but one with very little actual intellectual content. It's a kind of nitpicking, pettifoggery history that's blind to essentials. And I think she's somewhat fallen into that. I mean, she's someone who I very much admire. I've admired her works in the past. She's shown a lot of courage, but she's not showing intellectual courage. And I think it's too many of the people who are responding to her from the pro-reason movements of various sorts are doing it with, in a way, too much deference. She's a hero. She's done these great things. She's a wonderful person in these various respects. I respect her a lot, but I happen to disagree with her on this. I read an essay from Michael Shermer like that. And I think she deserves some moral censure about this. She knows better than this, and she's lying to herself. This is a pragmatic argument for God. We need to believe in God, not that there's evidence for him or reason to think it's true. What reasons are given to think that it works are obviously fallacious, and the lies behind them have been exposed a million times throughout history. This is not a serious line of thinking. And she is a serious person who's capable of a lot better. And I think Don, in his piece on it, actually, the first thing I thought when I read her essay, I texted Don. I said, this would be a great thing for you to respond to. And he said, I'm on it. And I don't know if he already was.
I sent an email already as soon as I read the piece to Don saying,
yeah, I mean, he's
to write an essay on this.
Really fantastic work on these kinds of themes. So it's why he occurred to both of us. And his title was something like, forget exactly how he put it, but shameful conversion to Christianity. And I think that's it's something to be ashamed of. Not that anyone ever becoming a Christian is, but this way. This is precisely because she has such a heroic history, because she's such a substantial person, because she's so bright, and because she's overcome so much. That's not a reason to excuse this. The context of that makes this more damning. She knows better than that.
You see this as a cultural phenomenon that is, we've seen, not to compare him to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but Dave Rubin take this stand, but many others. It seems like Kissen, the guy from trigonometry, had an essay about how, all that happens to secular world is they adopt a different God, whether it's environmentalism or woke. Is this now a trend? And as intellectuals, as some of these intellectuals adopt religion who are secular, we know how intellectuals impact the culture. Is this a direction a culture is going to take?
I think it is a kind of trend. It's a kind of trend towards something like what the neocons were on religion, right? People who didn't quite believe it, but they believed other people needed to, or they believed they needed to in certain moments, so they didn't think it was literally true. And they had some kind of line of compartmentalizing and BSing themselves. And this is a kind of thing I grew up around a lot of people saying this kind of thing. It's not a new way of thinking, right? It's all well and good for you to know it's not true, but the regular people, they need this, or I need it in certain moments. It's a kind of, I think, dishonest, and it's sort of nothing new, but it's definitely gained in ascendancy recently. And you have this rhetoric of, a God-shaped hole that's left in people's lives, that's left in the society, and anything can reach in to fill it. And I mean, there are two questions: what to make of that line of reasoning and what to make of its popularity. What to make of it is God is a reason-shaped hole in people's souls and in the culture. God is something that's made up, and it's made up to take the place of serious valuing and thinking. Of valuing and thinking about the deepest issues. It was come up with initially before human beings knew how to do that. And it's something that we've sort of grown out of in many areas of our life, but haven't grown out of in the areas of life where it takes the most sophistication to learn to think for yourself about the nature of the universe, about the nature of values. And God has always been something that's filling a hole that's left by a deficit. It's not that God's there naturally or belongs there, and when he goes, we substitute something in. Rather, it's in our nature, and to live up to our nature is to develop our minds to perform certain tasks. And when they're not developed in that way, other things pick up the slack. And religion is one of them. Religion is one of the things that fills the hole, and is no worse a thing to fill the hole, or sorry, no better a thing to fill the hole than the things that the neo-religionists are worried about. Wokeism. Yeah. Wokeism is not something to be concerned about in a way that religion isn't. Wokeism is just a kind of watered down recent version of Christianity. And even the metaphor of being woke is a Christian metaphor. You're woken. I mean, my name, Gregory, is the Greek pluperfect of a word to wake up. And it's the name of popes, because you're woke to the truth of Jesus and so forth. And now you're woke to the truth of systematic oppression. But it's all the same kind of thing. There's nothing civilized or exalted or even spiritually uplifting about Christianity. All of that is stuff that's been grafted onto it. And it's stuff that's been grafted onto it from an essentially rational secular origin. If you really think about Christianity, you're thinking of the Dark Ages. That's what Christianity wrought.
So what about the argument that we're facing a civilizational crisis? There's a real war out there, both with Islam and with Putin and with China. And the reality is that the secular voices in the United States, in the West, are dominated by woke, which tend to align themselves with these horrible forces that the Western civilization, and that the only people who talk the language of Western civilization, the only people who are standing for what seems like the values of Western civilization are Christians, are the religionists. And maybe we need to align with them, or maybe we need to even become them in order to win this war that we're facing.
It's not true. I mean, what language of Western civilization is Putin speaking? And what language of Western civilization are the most extreme of the evangelical preachers and the people who are in their sway speaking? This is not, the argument is very much like, we're being attacked by Sunni Muslims, we better become Shia, or vice versa, or the Crips are after us, let's join the Bloods. They're all variants of the same thing. And the alternative isn't to write off religious people. It's to speak to the best within them. It's true that there are lots of good Christians and lots of good Muslims and lots of good people who are somewhat leftist and lots of good people who are somewhat libertarianish and lots of good people who are somewhat whatever. It's just that those things aren't what's good about them. It's not where what's good in them comes from. They might think it is, but they're wrong. That's a bad idea that's serving as a locus to integrate around for them some things that are better than that idea. And you don't have to say religion's awful. I think some people need to say religion's awful, and it's part of our job to say what's wrong with it. But if you're a political candidate or somebody rallying something or creating a cause, what you want to say is like, here's what's good. What's good about the West is individualism. What's good about the West is reason. What's good about the West is the scientific method. What's good about the West is freedom and capitalism and the pursuit of happiness and technology and prosperity and great art. And if you can have that with your religion, or a version of your religion that's compatible with that, great. And if not, I don't think ultimately they are compatible. But the idea that it comes from it, and the idea of trying to form that as the point of a movement or a point to rally around cannot work. It hasn't worked, and it can't work. All it is joining the cause of destruction.
Yeah, Ayan Hirsi Ali, she quotes this book Dominion, which I've seen quoted suddenly. I've seen a lot of people quoting this book. So I downloaded it today. I started reading it this morning. So it's very well written. So I'll give it that. So far, it's well written, and the first chapter is quite good. So I'm curious to see how it develops and how it presents its case. As Don, I think, quoted in his article, Dominion also says that woke is a derivative of Christianity, right? So I think the argument he's going to make in the book is pretty much, given the dominance of Christianity for 2,000 years, everything in the West today is a product of Christianity. I think that's wrong, but I think that's where the book is ultimately going to land up.
Yeah, but I mean, I haven't read the book yet, but what is the Christianity that it's a product of? That is, if you think about the essence of Christianity, what's distinctive about it from other movements, what's distinctive about it from other ideas, what's distinctive about it from other religions, none of that has anything to do with freedom or reason or even really individualism. Maybe a little bit. Some people have thought, Rand at one period thought that, but I don't think it's true. It's insofar as everyone has been Christian, they've had to connect whatever they believe to their Christianity. And so you can find versions of Christianity that have everything connected to them, from Plato, which isn't part of Jesus' teaching, but got baked into the religion pretty early, to Aristotle and Aquinas, to every other kind of element. That's not to say they're coming from Christianity. It makes sense to think of them as Christian, but they were spread maybe through some Christian conduits, as they were also spread through Muslim conduits at some point in history, or Jewish conduits, or socialist conduits, for that matter.
Yep. So, which reminds me, I've been meaning to ask you this. Do the Greeks have the concept of individualism? And so what does it mean for the Greeks? What would individualism mean for the Greeks?
I don't think there isn't like an ism, an abstract noun that would be individualism for the Greeks. The closest I can come up with is autarkes, which you could think of as independent. It's often translated self-sufficiency or autarkeia, which Aristotle and then the Hellenistic philosophers think is a good thing to develop in yourself. And it's basically not needing a lot, both not needing a lot from other people, but also, not needing a lot of wealth. You're kind of secure, right? And the Hellenistic philosophers took that to a kind of fetish where, you had to develop some mental state where you were imperturbable from anything that happened to the world. But that's the closest I can think of to an ism that's individualism. But there was this idea in the call it the Socratic tradition, so Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, of your soul is what matters. Your people are too concerned about their wealth, they're too concerned about their body, even in comparison to their soul. Your soul is what matters. And that idea is, I think, as much in Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle as in anyone later, certainly as much as it is in Christianity. What there isn't, though, until a little bit later, is the idea that, and you can maybe attribute to Christianity, but I think it's more attributable to the Stoics, if anything, the idea that all people are equal in some way, that there's some kind of common humanity that we share. This is a theme that becomes important in the better and worse thinkers of the Enlightenment, versus that we are sort of metaphysically in castes. And unfortunately, Plato and Aristotle both have a kind of metaphysical caste system.
But do you think the Stoics have a type of equality?
Well, both the Stoics and Christians sort of have it, but by bringing people down. So in effect,
so we're all sinners. It would be
in the Christian version, we're all radically dependent on God's redemption and so forth. And in the Stoic version, we're sort of all ultimately incapable. I mean, they think of it that there's a kind of capability in it, but there's no power to influence reality, and so we're all sort of just playing out Zeus's plan. So there's in Christianity and in Stoicism a kind of determinism, a kind of lack of freedom, lack of initiative. And there's something wrong with thinking of yourself as being in charge, of being powerful, of having the meek shall inherit the earth. Pride cometh before the fall. Christian, which of you makes the increase? You don't make the plant grow when you water it. It's God that makes it. And there's similar stuff in Islam. And I think the Stoics don't put it that way. There's a similar kind of feeling in Stoicism, so that thinking well of yourself as an individual, trying too hard, trying to make too much of yourself, then is a sin. And then that is associated with, great people, kings, tyrants, but also actual great people, business people and great achievers.
So where do you think historically individualism, or intellectually and historically? Where does it come from, and when does it appear?
So I think there is some of it in this Greek tradition that's positive in Plato and Aristotle, certainly in Aristotle, in Socrates, but it's not shed of this kind of elitism. And I think too much of the way it came through Christianity and through Stoicism was by bringing everybody down. Nobody can be like Aristotle thought we can be, rather than more people can be that way than you thought. The traits that make the virtuous person able to do what he's able to do are traits that everybody can develop in a way, maybe at different levels of ability, but we're not divided into species. And exactly when that common humanity of us becomes common, I'm not sure who the first thinkers who are that way, but it seems to be around by the beginning of the kind of pre-Enlightenment. One thing I've noticed is even in Descartes, there's a really interesting line at the beginning of his Discourse and Method about, I forget what he called it, right reason. Basically, the ability to distinguish true and false seems to be the most well-distributed thing. Even people who always complain that they didn't get a fair share of anything don't complain they don't have that they can't tell what's true. And so you get this idea that associated in the early kind of Enlightenment with figures like Bacon, Locke, and Descartes of we need a method. We need a method because we can't rely on authority. What the difference between people who get things right, who discover important things, who really know stuff, and other people is that the people who get it right, who know stuff, etc., are doing something right. There's a skill they've acquired. There's something they've learned, and you can learn it too. So it's this idea that I often stress, that knowledge is work. You see that in this generation or two of thinkers. Did it start with them? I'm not sure. I'm not sure to what extent you'll find it in the generation or two before, but you definitely see it in Bacon, you definitely see it in Descartes, you definitely see it in Locke, and I think Locke is, in a way, a high watermark for this kind of thinking.
I mean, aesthetically, it seems to be in the Renaissance, right? It seems to be in. So if you look at the Middle Ages, painting and sculpture, all the faces look the same. There's no, and there seems to be some breakthrough that happens in the Renaissance of individuation, of respect for the individual in some sense that hadn't existed before. Even if you look at Greek and Roman sculpture, even if you look at Greek and Roman art.
I think that's right. There's a kind of respect for beauty or greatness in Greek thinking, but not, and there's kind of implicit notes of individuality, but there's not the sense of there's not, like, for example, the idea of a creative genius. There's not the idea. I mean, there are people who were seen as creative geniuses, but they did stuff really well. There's the stamp of the personal is not part of the exaltation you get of them. Certainly not in Aristotle or Plato. You'll like a great sculptor will be described as so great his sculptures could come alive or whatever. Not so great they bear the mark of his individuality or his soul. And if you think of like a post-Renaissance description, that intense personalness is always there. And where did that come from? Again, there's this idea that it came from something in Christianity. I don't see it. But if it did, it had to be merged with a respect for reason and reality to get there. I think it's something new, and I don't quite know where it starts.
Well, and it's clearly inspired by the Greeks and the Romans, right? It's clearly inspired by the discovery of Greek sculpture and the discovery of a Greek and the writings of the Greeks, and it's a Renaissance. It's a Renaissance of something. It's a Renaissance of Greece, and without that, I don't think it happens. So it's something in the intellectual air of the time merging with the discovery of Greece somehow brings this to the forefront.
And a fascination with larger than life characters, I think, also might be part of it. And you do again have that in Greece. I mean, part of what makes Plato so compelling as an author is his portrait of Socrates as this kind of, unmistakable personality. And then, of course, there's Alexander the Great, and there's Pericles, and every society had its great men, but there's a sense of them as having a distinctive personality. You could see it in the portraiture. It's just that's not what was praised about portraiture.
Yeah. I mean, I seem that you get that sense in Shakespeare as well. So, I mean, it's dark and it's not heroic in the sense it is with the Greeks, but it's there in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's early Renaissance.
Yeah.
Mid-Renaissance, yeah.
And you'd think, yeah, you know, Othello, Iago,
Yeah.
King Lear, these are persons that you've had an encounter with. They're
Yep.
not just, you know, set pieces.
Yep. Which is I think what most of the literature of the Middle Ages was.
I mean, the question is to what extent is Greek literature like that? And Antigone certainly is a character,
Yep.
Oedipus, but there's some. I don't know. There's a way in which they're more personal, I think, in Shakespeare than in Greek.
I think that's right. Okay, let's take some of the super chat questions. We got quite a few of them. Okay, so Shazbot says, why don't the advocates for socialized medicine also push for socialized food? I mean,
Well,
I think yeah. What's that?
They did for a while. We had collectivized farming, and it killed millions of people, right?
They still do in Venezuela over the last 20 years. They did socialize food, and a lot of people died of starvation.
But I think there is a reason why they don't, which is that there were well-established, known ways of making food.
Yep.
And when we tried to socialize them, there was immediate, obvious falling off. We knew how much, you know, wheat should be grown in the Ukraine, and suddenly there was not that much wheat grown in the Ukraine, right? We knew how much, and so there was an experiment that was started at a delimited time where there was a track record of what not less collectivized production in agriculture looked like. And then the numbers, you know, went off a cliff, and people could see everybody was starving, and it was seen as a catastrophe, right? And the same thing in a way, but also in reverse, happened in China with the experiment about letting some people work their own land. There was a kind of baseline. Medicine was a very new field in terms of its actually being able to accomplish anything at the time that it started to get socialized. So we haven't seen what it could really be if it were free. And so the effects of the socialization are a lot more what Bastiat would call the unseen. Whereas I think there was more of an opportunity to see it happen with food. And so people saw the horrors and they backed off of that, but they didn't understand what principle those horrors were coming from. So they didn't, you know, think it applied to all other fields.
Yeah, and in medicine, because it's so new, we have nothing to compare it to. The horrors that it produces just seem natural to the industry. It takes a little bit of imagination and actual thinking to imagine a world where the socialized doesn't exist. And people are not very good at integrating their knowledge from one field to another, sadly. Let's see, Adam, also in healthcare. Is socialized medicine not yet another manifestation of altruism? Sacrificing providers to the collective and sacrificing innovation and efficiency for equal care today. Tough to move to free markets in this environment.
I think that's right. I mean, I think all collectivism is a manifestation of altruism. And it's a manifestation of altruism, and it's associated with a non-productive mentality. So the goods are here. How did they get here? We don't know. Nothing has causes, but some people don't have them. So we have to make sure that everybody has the healthcare that some other people have, without thinking of the healthcare as something that's produced, that can be produced more, that we don't have the healthcare we will have in the future if we're free to produce it, and without thinking of like what we're doing by eating up our seed stock for the future. So yes, but it does come from altruism, and altruism engenders short-sightedness. Altruism engenders thinking about who's suffering now and what could be done, or who has less now and what could be done to make sure they have less, at the expense of anybody creating or producing more, and therefore at the expense of the future, and at the expense of the most capable people at any given time.
Yeah, and we see altruism in, I mean, altruism, Rand said something about an orgy of altruism, the world is dying from it. You definitely see it now with the Israel Hamas, and in the whole idea that somebody by just because they're suffering, by definition, they must be the right, they must be virtuous, they must be sacrificed to, even if that sacrifice means the sacrificing civilization.
And no sense of what it takes not to be suffering.
Mm-hmm.
There's no focus, like even if you focus on that there's some difference between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and even if you're pro-Israeli and think of them as civilized, the focus would tend to be on, well, what's wrong with these Palestinians? Or maybe it's wrong to think there's anything wrong with them, so there can't be, so it's just that they're suffering. But there's no focus on like what's right about the Israelis. Like for almost all of human history, everybody lived like people live under Hamas. Everybody was poor and miserable and under the thumb of some despot, and the despot was feuding with the next group over and so forth. What's unusual in human history is that some people are free and prosperous and happy and able to have societies where they can advance in and come up with new values that were never had by anybody before, that then other people can be envious of. What causes that? And if we're focused always on the suffering and the have-nots, we're not thinking about what's good and what's right about those societies that are prosperous, about those people who are succeeding, but in particular, in this case, about the societies. What is it about Israel, about Europe, about America that makes them better? And then what would it look like for that to come to Gaza, to come to the West Bank, for it to come to Iran, for it to come to all the places where it isn't now? What has to be achieved? And altruism is incompatible with a focus on achievement because it's fixated on lack.
All right. Let's see. Andrew asks, why is nihilism gaining power?
I mean, one of the issues we have to think about on what time scale. If we're talking about on the many centuries time scale, I think the answer is there was these ideas, individualism, focus on reason, focus on this world, freedom, were discovered and developed, but they were incompatible with the morality or large elements of the morality that we had inherited, with traditional Western morality, let's call it, that is, with Christianity. And a new and better one hadn't been developed. And likewise, there were similar issues in epistemology. The science, the ability to have real insight into how nature worked was developed, but this is sort of technical, but the understanding of how the mind works to make that possible, the understanding of the formation of concepts, which is at the foundation of knowledge, and the relationship between concepts and percepts wasn't well understood. The old answers weren't sufficient. They weren't capable of underwriting this new kind of knowledge. And so either those answers were going to be found or skepticism was going to emerge. And the answers weren't found, and so skepticism did emerge. This is what happened in the Enlightenment epistemologically. And then I think something similar happens ethically because of the refusal to challenge altruism. And then in Kant, who's, of course, the objectivist villain in history, and I think for good reason, he merges these two things. He's able to save religious morality, basically, by establishing that scientific knowledge and our ability to think only applies to a world of appearances. So there could be a real world behind it about which you can't know anything. And then that world could have in effect, issue you orders. And then you could have to be a good boy and have faith that there's a God who will reward you for it, since what being a good boy means is acting with no reference to rewards in a way that's unintelligible to you, except that you somehow know you have to do it, and you're entitled to hope you'll be rewarded for it. So that's a kind of nihilistic philosophy, and it was injected into Western culture and was able to be injected into it because there were real problems, real philosophical questions that weren't answered, that were needed to understand and take full control of what human beings were doing.
About it?
What?
What's nihilistic about it?
Well, the knowledge we can have isn't of what's real and important. What's real and important, we can't have knowledge about, and all we can know about it, basically, is that we can't have knowledge about it. And what we ought to do in life is not orient ourselves towards values, but orient ourselves to anything we want or can come up with anything we could get out of it. And indeed, we can only identify what things are our duties by identifying the fact that they're not things that we value.
Yep.
There has to be a method of acting that's kind of not on values. There's technicalities to how it works, but that's the essence of Kant's ethics. So everything's defined by negatives. The real is defined by what's not anything like what you could perceive, and the good is defined by what's not like anything you could want or get anything out of. So it's all, as Rand said, their definitions are acts of wiping out. And that's a kind of negative theology, it's sometimes called in religion, that's kind of behind Kant's whole approach. So I think if you're thinking of like this grand historical narrative, you can think of Kant as the bad guy. But that doesn't explain, why 1990 wasn't much worse than 1980, maybe was better in some ways, but 2003 is worse than 2013, right? You need more, and you need much more local and granular causes to explain the more local and granular movements towards the good or the bad in the culture. And I don't have a full theory of that, but here are a few things. I mean, I think the most nihilistic movements kind of got out over their skis in the late 60s and early 70s. Most Americans kind of rebelled against them. At the same time, you had Ayn Rand, who I think inspired a lot more people than people realize, and then realize themselves what her role in their lives was. And you have people like Milton Friedman defending free markets. And you have this in a context where you have a country that's freaked out by the hippies, and so backing off from them and electing smaller government kind of politicians. And that I think opens up enough freedom for some of the people inspired about technology to create Silicon Valley and the business boom and the computer revolution, and that itself inspired a lot of people. And so you have a lot of things kind of tending towards the better. And then I think 9/11 and the financial crisis in different ways really disillusioned people. Both our failure to respond to 9/11, which I think is a result of altruism, and there's just tremendous talks about this, mostly by Yaron, but Leonard Peikoff and others. Just Yaron, you did more speaking on it than anyone else.
I did.
Kind of predicting what was going to happen, and I remember having a strong sense of what was going to happen on 9/11. I was at the beginning of grad school then, that we're not going to deal with this, and it's going to really lead to a decay, and I think it did. And then I think not only did it lead to a decay, but a real sense of betrayal when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't work out the way people expected. The best thing that came out of this was the new atheist movement, which identified 9/11 as, in effect, to borrow a phrase from Bush, a faith-based initiative. And there were a lot of people who became more vocal about their atheism, but they didn't have, they were too much influenced by human Kant. They didn't have answers to the kinds of questions that needed to be answered to give up religion. And so they couldn't make that much headway with people. And you see a lot of people turning back from it now. And then in the time of the financial crisis, I think, again, a lot of disillusion with America. And I don't understand everything that went behind the kind of, the other thing is there was a real, if you think about the pro-freedom movement, or what could have been the pro-freedom movement that began in the late 60s or early 70s, the movement that happened when people were put off by the hippies and put off by Lyndon Johnson, basically, it got infected with two strains of it, got infected with, I think, really negative ideas. So the religious kind of conservatism of Bill Buckley and the anarchistic libertarianism of Murray Rothbard. And I think those strands kind of dominated pro-freedom, what could have been pro-freedom thinking, anti-statist thinking for so long. I think the better people in those movements were less affected by those strands, but they were still a big part of the ethos of both movements. And I think they've become more and more dominant over time. Did that have to happen? Could the objectivists at the time, or the people more influenced by them, have done better? I don't know, but those are the things that did become dominant. And that for those movements are limited in their ability to be forces for the good and often become forces for the bad. And I think now the conservative movement has lost almost all of the pro-freedom elements it had. And the liberal movement or leftist movement is, has this had less real pro-freedom elements than the conservative movement had at one point, although it did have some in abortion rights and so forth. But now it's become, it's just this really ugly, anti-Semitism, anti-West, anti-colonialist element in it that, makes it a real source of evil.
Yep. All right. Brian has this question. Thoughts on spending bill that just passed the House that sneaks in a requirement that new cars have remote kill switches in the name of tackling drunk drivers. So somebody can remotely turn your car off. And the cars have to have it, and you have to give it. I'm not sure how that works. And I haven't seen the spending bill, so I'm surprised that they passed one. It must have gotten some Democratic votes. So, I don't expect this House Speaker to last very long if he cut a deal with the Democrats.
Yeah, this is also the first I'm hearing about that bill. Congress usually spends like drunk sailors, but I didn't know they were going to do anything about drunk drivers. It seems a little troubling that, someone else should have control of your car, but
it wouldn't surprise me.
But it seems small on the list of things to worry about.
Yep. Sylvanos, hard not to be black-pilled on subjects like Israel, Hamas, and the public reaction. Even if the majority knows what's right, the extremes are slowly pulling society towards the cliff, despite the resistance from objectivism. Would Galts Gultch be safe today?
I know red-pilled and blue-pilled. I don't know black-pilled. Do you know black-pilled?
I know. I can look it up.
Presumably it makes you unhappy or depressed. I don't think a literal Galts Gultch would have been possible in any time, and I don't think Rand thought it would have been. I think the sort of what the meaning or implementation of that novel is in our world is that there's a kind of breaking with the society and culture that you have to do intellectually and spiritually. And I think there's a way in which you can get into a Gulch by doing that, and you can still do that. And is it, or are we safe? Well, by historical standards, I think we're safer now than most people have ever been.
Yep.
There's a lot bad. There's a lot on the horizon that's worrying, but I don't think, the odds of you're getting killed by a terrorist, in Austin or Puerto Rico or New York, or even by a mugger or a drunk driver are that high that you should not try to make a life for yourself. I think it's very possible to. And in general, I think fights against the bad, fights against the evil, resisting of the evil, have to be undertaken in a context of trying to make a good life for yourself. Otherwise, you become fixated on a nursing of a grievance. And that's in effect what Hamas is. Yep. Whether the grievance is legitimate or illegitimate, or take the PLO to take something less religious, whether the grievance is legitimate or illegitimate, and we could debate about the particular, someone whose house or whatever in the past. I think some cases are legitimate and some aren't. But whatever the grievance you have, if your life is kind of organized around, I'm going to fight this grievance and I'm going to reject this thing and I'm going to be angry about it, and that's not a part of, you're trying to make something of your life. You're trying to do something with your life. You have something you love and want out of life. And you recognize that you're a victim of an injustice. And as part of going ahead in your life, you're going to try to, make people aware of that. And you're going to try to rectify the injustice when you can. That's the right way to do it. But if it becomes that you're living just to nurse your grievance, like the Count of Monte Cristo or something, that's not, that novel's cool and exciting, but that's not a kind of life to live for a real person. And I think one has to put, the bad in life in context like that.
So black-pilled is a cynicism pill. It's a, what's the point? A bit of a nihilistic pill. So I guess the thing is here, you know, what's the point even in the Israeli Hamas? The extremes are what they're defining the whole thing. It's hopeless for the rest of us.
I give a talk once on the fountainhead on what matters and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a scene in that novel that had a real influence on my life and thinking about these things, and as a young man made me not be cynical. And so I recommend that novel and that scene, and more self-congratulatory that talk. It's the scene where Rourke and Dominique and Mallory and I think Mike are in the building site of the Stoddard Temple, and there are these barriers around it so nobody could see it, and they're sort of like in a world on their own, and they just enjoy being with each other and enjoy doing their work, and it's like no one else exists. And I thought, this is a nice world, and these people are real. I mean, within the novel they're real, but also people like that are good are real. And the fact that everybody outside of it doesn't understand or has things wrong with them, that doesn't change this. What matters is what's good and what's real, and the other people are, taking up space, and you got to learn how to avoid them and not get hurt by them. And but it doesn't dim the goodness of what's good. And you only need a small number of people in your life personally to have that. And then you need to have access to what's good in most people who are really mixed. But you do have access to what's good in most people. That's what an economy gives you, right? If you step back, human beings made skyscrapers and airplanes and satellites and so forth, despite some of them being religious and some of them being nihilists and some of them being whatever. And you can access that aspect of them. You could access a certain amount of the best in everybody through the marketplace. And then you could access the very best of the very best people through forming personal relationships with them. And all of those things give you the values that can sustain you spiritually and materially to live a good life. And it's only in the context of doing that where you're free enough to do it. And almost everybody, well, I don't want to say everybody listening to the show is, because some people might be listening to the show, in Iran or someplace, but most people listening to the show are. And it's in the context of living and enjoying a life that then you fight to expand your capability, to get rid of the barriers, to fight for a society in which you'll be able to do it more fully. But there's no use fighting for that if you're not doing it to the extent that you can now, and you can do it to a significant extent.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so Ibis is here. That's good.
Oh, hi,
great to see Greg back on. Thanks for the awesome current event coverage this month, Yaron. Question for Greg. Do you have any thoughts on philosophy of history and the value of history, and recommendations around these issues?
But no, I mean, in the case of philosophy of history, like the people who have written on it and the different theories of it, I just don't know enough about it. I have theories about what's fundamental. I mean, I have a view, the Objectivist view, about what's fundamental to human nature and what's fundamental to human action, which has an implication for what will be fundamental. The ideas will be the fundamental driver of history. But it's not a subject I've, read all the different people's views on, and Hegel and this one and that one. So I don't have much to say about that. As for the value of reading history, I mean, I could just talk about it personally. Leonard Peikoff gave a lecture a long time ago on the value of knowing history to be a philosopher, and you really have to know a lot about it. And I forget exactly how he put it, but I remember when I first read it or heard it, I was a little skeptical. I thought, of course, it's useful to know some of what happened, but he's overstating the case or whatever. But I've he was right, and I've fallen in love with learning about history. I read a ton of history now. There's just so much interesting to know about what people have done. And so many questions it raises about what's possible to human beings and why things happen, that I just think it's certainly part of any active life of the mind to learn a lot about history and to have it be it's just endlessly fascinating. But I don't have very much abstract to say about it.
All right, Vadim says, what's the best way for doctors to fight socialized medicine?
Well, I mean, this is a question, we'll address somewhat on Saturday. And so listen into the panels and we'll hear different people's opinion. But I think one has to think about issues of scale. There's one question is, what can you do in your own life and your own career if you're a doctor, and also if you're a patient, right? Anybody dealing with any aspect of this industry, to be able to do work you love and that you can do well as possible and as freely as possible. And that's going to be really situationally dependent on what kind of specialty are you in and what kind of work do you like. And in some fields of medicine, it's easier than others because you can more isolate your practice than others. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. But you've got to think about, how can I chart a career here where I can do work that I love and that I'm happy with and fight the worst effects of it in my own life? And then there's the question of what can we do to advocate for a freer healthcare system? And I think, and what can doctors in particular do? There, I think you have to have a clear sense of what's wrong and what the ideal is. And again, that's one of the things we're going to be talking about on Saturday. And then you have to identify specific measures that people who don't agree with you on everything that's wrong and who don't agree with you about the ideal can nonetheless be persuaded to see as things that are positive or steps in the right direction. Think of the way the socialists fought for what they wanted. They, from the beginning, had a sense that we want socialized medicine. But for now, and they admitted it, many of them, that that's what they wanted, right? But, grandpa's old and he doesn't have so we need medicine for him. And then we need a prescription of a plan B to cover the medicines. And we need, you think about incremental things that solve small problems, but moving in the direction that you want. And likewise, I think you need to think about what things solve problems that people can recognize as problems, where the solutions are movements in the direction of freedom. And we're going to give a lot of suggestions of particular things like that on Saturday. So I won't scoop myself with them now. And then the third component, so the first component is thinking about what can make a good career for yourself. The second component, or 2A, is having a vision for what the good would look like, and 2B is having incremental steps towards it. And then the third component is how to create a movement around those steps, and to fight for it politically. And that Don's going to talk about, so I'll leave it to him to say a bit about that.
Good. All right. Let's see. All right, we've got a bunch of these questions, so you tell me when you're out of time, and I'll take.
I can keep going for a bit.
All right,
Basically, I just have to go downstairs and put Alan to bed at some point, and he can go to bed a little later. So
let's do ones that are clearly for you. Hopper Campbell says, Greg, who will you be voting for in 2024 if it's Trump versus Biden?
If it's Trump versus Biden, Biden. Biden's awful. He's been a bad president. He's been less bad than the last couple of presidents, but he's been very bad. But it's a horrifying thought. He might be as good as we can do as a country. I hope we can do better. I think it's obvious that he's better than Trump. That's not a high bar. But if I had to pick between those two, I think it's a fairly easy choice, though it's a very distasteful one.
Yep. Greg, what are your thoughts on Vivek and Ron DeSantis?
I mean, Vivek just seems clownish. And I don't think he's a serious candidate. He said some very good things, but also some really crazy bad things. And I don't know, that's what to say about him. DeSantis, I think at one point was more of a serious candidate. I think he's, I don't admire him as a governor. I think he's an anti-free speech and anti-business in very much the same ways as, I'm blanking on his name, the governor of California is, but just with a different political tribal alignment. But I think he's way better than Trump, and I would be, very much relieved if he became the Republican nominee. And if it was up to DeSantis versus Biden, I don't know who it would depend on how the election played out and what they were each advocating for at the time. And I might not vote, or I might vote for either of them. I don't know.
Yep. All right. Let's see. The Doodle Bunny says, Greg, don't peers know you're an do your peers, okay. Do your peers know you're an objectivist? Have you ever been confronted by hostile faculty or students for teaching objectivism?
Yes, and not really. So, I mean, everywhere that I've worked, many of my peers have known that I was objective. I don't know if everybody, That was the case when I was in graduate school. It was the case at all my jobs. Many of my jobs have been, or all of them in one way or another, have been supported by Anthem and other objectivist organizations. So it was sort of part of the, part of the mix that I was there for that reason. But even when I was a grad student, and I've always taught Ayn Rand in classes, not every class, but the classes where it's appropriate given the topic. And I've never gotten any pushback about that. The only times I did was when I was on the job market for academic positions. Well, one, I'm sure there were a lot of places I didn't get interviews for because there were things on my CV that were red flags, but that I don't, hear about directly. But once or twice in interviews, I was asked, like, really, Ayn Rand, isn't she awful? Why do you teach? I've got like kind of explicit pushback in that situation, but not other than that. And not from students. I mean, the students, not that many students are that confrontational with their professors.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see.
I will say other than there are a lot of people who I've met professionally at conferences or so forth who didn't know at first that I was an objectivist, and then it came up later. Yeah. And we had a rapport or whatever and so forth. And most of them seem to regard it as kind of, like quizzical.
Yeah.
Rather than, either being excited or horrified.
All right, let's see. Michael says, will healthcare be one of the last things that get privatized in our march away from altruism and towards a free society?
I think it might be before, I don't know, banking or something. I think if the country is liberating, there will be a lot of fields that are liberating in tandem, but by degrees. So it won't be like, food production will be 100% free, but medicine will be just like it is now. And then it'll be turned for medicine. I think you'll start to see gradual deregulation and liberalization of fields in tandem. And I don't think medicine will be the first, but it might be one of the first to get a little less regulated than it is now, because it's just so regulated now. And I think progress has to start on the places that are most tightly controlled.
Yeah, and the benefits are so great. And the more we move towards socialism, the pain is going to be so substantial that I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing.
And what I expect
might be the first among the first ones. What's that?
And what I expect you'll find is pockets, certain subsets of the industry or certain places, or drugs to deal with certain issues.
Yep. All right, let's see. Richard says, I like the desocialized medicine idea. How about deprogramming postmodernism from academia, replacing it with objectivism? We're working on that.
Deprogramming postmodernism.
Yeah.
Or I mean, the what I worry about with this postmodernism has taken over the universities rhetoric. There's something true about it, but it's not as though the universities were just fine, 30 years ago. I mean, they were totally infiltrated by communists and other. There are respects in which they're worse now, and respects in which they're better. They're more homogenous intellectually now, I think, than they were in the past, but with sparks of little enclaves that are really different. But the mean is more homogenous now. But some of this language that you hear about the long march for the universities or whatever makes it seem like everything was fine and this cabal programmed it wrong. The university systems, the ideas that were dominant in universities have been bad for as long as there have been universities, and certainly as long as there have been any of our present universities in America, with brief periods where they've been a bit better. And I do think it's important to try to fix them and make them better, and to create alternatives to the universities and alternative centers within universities and so forth. But it's not like there's just one, thing that's come to infect it and we get rid of that infection and things are fine. The job is bigger than that. We need to, reform the thinking of the society. And the universities are in effect like the organs of the society where much of the detailed, intensive intellectual work and passing on of ideas happens. And so as we reform the society, they'll be reformed as well. And it'll be an important part of that reformation.
Related, somebody asked here, where is it? Related to alternative universities, somebody's asking, thoughts on University of Austin getting its degree granting status?
Well, I was supposed to be at a reception for that tonight. There was a like a cocktail hour that I was going to go to, but when we scheduled this show and a few other things, meant I couldn't make it to it. I'm pleased that they got this. I haven't heard much of the latest. I was expecting to hear it at that dinner, and I'm sure I'll hear about it from friends who were there or read about it soon. I think it's good. I'm a little underwhelmed by what I've seen from them so far. I'm impressed that they got the degree granting status so quickly and they're moving ahead. I'm a little underwhelmed by their ability to do something different. So I think there are two things. If you just took the existing universities and rebooted them, like you reboot a computer, like took all their documents and policies and so forth, but just started a new one and hired people fresh, I think that would be better than many of the existing universities. Is a kind of builds up there and practices. And so I think the minimal case scenario is that University of Austin does something like that. Minimal good scenario. It's not much different from another university, except that it's started new, and so it doesn't have a lot of the entrenched particular problems other ones have, and it's an alternative. And the more people see that you can do that, the more there will be other ones that crop up, and some of them will be good. Maybe that one, maybe some other. They see themselves as doing more than that. They see themselves as being a real alternative to something that's structurally wrong with the existing universities. But I don't see that they have any clear identification of what it is that's structurally wrong with the existing universities, or what they're doing that's going to change that or prevent it. And I had a conversation once with the president of it, where I was kind of pushing him on this, like, so is it you're not going to have tenure, or you are, but it's going to be different, or you're going to run things in a different way? And I was just surprised by how little content he had about, like, what are you doing to make this a different kind of place? And I was a little bit underwhelmed, but I wish them the best, and they have some really good people involved in it. Barry Weiss, I mentioned earlier, was involved in it. Yep. Some less good people too, but some really good people. So, I'm hopeful, but moderately hopeful. I'm glad that it's happening in the city that I'm part of, and so I get to see it up close.
Actually, somebody's asking, do you enjoy living in Texas more than New Jersey? Do you feel significantly freer?
No, I feel less free. There's no freedom that is really important to me that I feel like I have more of here. And abortion, which I think is an important right, is totally illegal here, and was totally legal where I was. So I think that's a big difference. And I think it's bigger. I mean, it would be very easy to get a gun here, but I don't particularly want a gun. And the biggest day-to-day life kind of freedom, that like something I can do that I couldn't do in New Jersey but could do here, would be get a gun. And that's, I think it's good for people who want them, and I think people should be able to own guns, but that's not an important value to me. Whereas sex and reproduction and having control of it is. So in that sense, I feel less free. The taxes are, in some ways a lot better, but property taxes are a lot higher. I don't think it's quite a wash, but it's, so I don't feel politically free here than I did in New Jersey. But I do like it here. I like it here because I like my job here. I like my house. I like the immediate things I'm around. And overall, I like the part of the country I was in before better. But I love about Texas that so many of my friends have come here at around the same time, that we have a lovely little community, and I really enjoy being here for that reason.
Yep. Justin says, what is right or wrong about the ideal of colorblindness? Is it wrong for someone to identify with their race? Most racial minorities do.
Well, the ideal of, yes. I think it's wrong if you primarily identify with your race, or with any other superficial aspect of you. Like, this is what it is about me. This is who I am. I think there are two respects in which it's fine to, one of which it's sometimes mandatory to. So there are going to be lots of optional values that somebody has that are going to have to do with their personal history, and maybe you like a certain kind of food or whatever because of where you were brought up, and that has to do with what group you were in, and so you think if that becomes too important to you or too central to you, I'm Italian or I'm whatever, then I think it's a sign that you don't have enough else going on. But if, I really love hummus or I really love whatever, and I think of that as part of my Jewish heritage or my Italian heritage or whatever, I think that's fine. And I have some things like that more to do with the Italian side of my family than the Jewish one, but nonetheless. But the other one is when you're a victim of persecution or prejudice, and this is something Yaron gave a really fantastic talk on Israel about back when I was in graduate school, I remember. When you're a victim of persecution or prejudice because of your race, because of your skin color, because of your biological background or whatever, then I think there's a need sometimes to own that fact about yourself, to know that, I'm a victim because of this, and or subject to being victimized because of this, and I need to know who else is in that same plight so that we can, band together for defense when it's necessary. I think that's a really dangerous thing to be focused on. It's necessary sometimes. I think it's why it's, I think, proper for Jews to have formed a state in Israel. I think it's why it was really important for there to be some Black organizations in America, the NAACP and so forth, but other ones too, to kind of support and like what, other organizations for different groups to fight these kinds of persecutions. But anytime you have it, there's a danger of making yourself too much about that. And it's the same kind of danger I talked about earlier about focusing too much on grievance or injustice against you. Where there are injustices against you, you have to be aware of it and you have to work about it. But you have to keep it in the context of a life that's not all about that. And insofar as the reason to take seriously the identification with your race is because it's a vector of victimization to you that you have to guard against, you do have to take it seriously, but you also have to guard against making it too central to you, because to do that is to make victimization too central to you. And I think very, very often that happens with most minority groups and most minority group identification groups. And it's hard to strike the balance quite right, but that's how I think about it.
Do you apply Montessori in your college classes?
Do I apply it in my college classes? Not really. I mean, there are, Montessori is a specific thing with specific methods, and
Yep.
At very abstract levels, there are some ideas about encouraging agency and so forth that I think about how I can apply in college classes. And I don't know that I have, tremendous insight into how to do it, but I do what I can. But it would be overly grand to call that applying Montessori.
Your view of Elon Musk advancing free speech through X, Twitter? He's not.
I mean, I was pleased when he bought it because I thought he might do something interesting with it. I never thought there's such a thing as a free speech company, or you could have a company whose policy is free speech. That's, I think, a really deep category error. Any more than you could have a free trade business and think of like, my free trade business is that I sell everything. That's not what a free trade business is. Free trade is that you're free to sell everything, but then your business is going to sell what it sells. And likewise, you can't have a free speech platform in the way I think Musk imagined he could. I think that was foolish. And I say that advisedly because he's so brilliant in so many ways. But I was still hopeful he would do something interesting with it. So far, I don't see that he has. I think the experience has gotten, maybe marginally worse, not a million times worse, but not way better. I've never been a real lover of Twitter. I go through spurts of using it for a few days and then not. Today's one of my spurts. But I haven't found that it's improved, and I hope it will, because it would be good for somebody to get a really better social media platform. And Elon Musk has certainly had enough success in enough industries that I wouldn't count him out, but he hasn't done it yet.
What is your moral assessment of Richard Hanania?
So first, I've never met him. He was affiliated with the Salem Center for a bit. He was doing a something on betting markets, and he was occasionally coming to give talks. And I wanted to meet him. I had it in mind next time he comes, I should try to meet him because I really liked some of his essays, but I didn't. So I don't have anything. I don't have any knowledge of him other than what you can get, from reading his essays. A number of them were really good, and continue to be really good. He continues to be really good on some issues, and he has a new book on civil rights and civil rights laws: The Origin of Woke, that I think has some bad things in it, but a lot of good in it. I think it's a book that's worth reading. And I think he really has changed from, so this is somebody who was revealed to have had a past on racist forums and white supremacy stuff and some really ugly things he's written in the past. And he then wrote an essay, why I used to suck and why I no longer do. And I think he really has improved in some significant ways, and in ways that give me hope for some of the worst people out there who are attracted to real racist things. Here's a trajectory that's really positive. But I don't think he's improved enough. In particular, in his piece about why he used to suck and why he no longer does, hopes he no longer does, there's again a lot of good in there, but I don't think he took seriously what's really gross and evil about his views. I don't think he took seriously that they're part of a movement that heard. It would be like if somebody was an apologist for Stalin and they wrote a piece like, whoops, here's why I made that stupid mistake, but no, and I was sanctioning a murderous dictator who killed a lot of people and so forth. There's no sort of moral tone to it, and I think the moral tone is important. And I think part of why that is because I think he is still a kind of racist and misogynist that is, I think, intellectually disreputable and morally bad, even though he's improved quite a bit on so many other fronts and is, an interesting thinker on a lot of topics.
Yeah, I've been surprised that he's fairly good on Israel. So, I mean, not always, I think, for the right reasons, but he does seem to be fairly good on it. Even in that essay, he was associating with a known anti-Semite, and with no apology. So I wasn't sure about him, but it's hard to tell why he's pro-Israel exactly. There's something a little weird about how he presents his defense of it.
I mean, there's a kind of civilization versus savagery aspect to it, and that's part of what you should, what should be.
But I'm suspicious because of his
right, because there's a lot of everything's heritable. And
Jews have high IQs and Arabs don't, or something like that,
And the kind of, I mean, people who talk about heritability and so much is innate and so forth and fancy themselves scientific, I think they just fancy themselves scientific. We don't, every human trait is somewhat heritable. But the idea that the difference between better functioning peoples and worse, between societies that are prosperous and societies that aren't, or segments of society, demographic groups that are prosperous and functioning well or living to their potential, and ones who aren't living well, the idea that is somehow determined by genes, or that genes is the primary cause of it, is not scientific. It's like thinking that, why some animals can fly and others can't is that their leg muscles are more developed. Like, we know what the main cause is. We know that culture makes such a difference in human beings that it's practically a difference in species, from like primitive cave people to people today. And we know that there are lots of differences in culture among and between us, of different cultures in different countries and different subcultures within countries, that we know how big a difference this makes, that anything else besides culture and the choices that lead to it and so forth are rounding errors. And I don't think for any two racial groups or demographic groups, I don't think we're in a position to know. Presumably there are, for any two populations, there's going to be some just by chance differences in the average, innate components of human skills. But I don't think we're in any position to know what they are and what direction they go at this point, because the confounding variables are just gigantic. It would be like finding a needle in a haystack. And I think it's not, like early IQ science had Chinese people at the bottom of the heap, and now they're at the top. And this is not science. This is a pre-science, and I just don't think it's serious.
And there's a sense in which, without acknowledging free will and without acknowledging the effort that reason requires and thinking requires, put aside the amount of horsepower you have, but just the effort that it requires, and some people do and some people don't. I don't think it really means anything.
Yeah, so there's, in addition to environment and genes, there's a third thing that determines how you come out, which is your choices, your free will. And culture is a kind of, mix of at least environment and choices. But the idea that if you had to pick between, focusing on culture and focusing on genes, you would focus on genes, and is anti-intellectual, I think. and unscientific.
Thoughts on Peter Thiel's political activism?
I don't know all that much about it. I mean, I know he's been a funder of various right-wing causes and other causes too, maybe, that he was a supporter of Trump, and that he's sort of backed away a little bit from financing politics. But I don't know very much about him other than that. And
he now says he won't support Trump again. He doesn't want Trump to win. He supported J.D. Vance, who's, I think, one of the worst two senators in the Senate. And he supported the guy in Arizona who lost. I forget his name, who I know, the guy in Arizona I've actually met. Latest thing is he's stepping back from politics, but it's typical of Peter. He's eclectic. He hates the status quo. He's looking for solutions. He's willing to dabble in all kinds of different solutions. Depends on the time and what's going on in the world. Obviously super smart in some realms of life, but not necessarily in political philosophy.
So anyway, I have no thoughts on him. Besides that, PayPal was good.
Yeah, gave a horrible speech at the Republican convention when he endorsed Trump. Why did the conservatives give up on liberty?
Well, it was never. There's a question as to how central it ever was to the conservative movement. I don't think Bill Buckley, for example, was ever a great lover of liberty. And conservatism is not a natural home for the love of liberty. Liberty is about change, development, etc. So I think what happened in Western history, really, or American European history, right, is that there was the intellectual vanguard was pro-liberty at a certain point. Roughly, in the Enlightenment, into the 19th century. And then, for various reasons to do with the way the ideas developed and mistakes that were made and certain confusions, and the stuff to do with the declining respect for reason that we spoke about earlier, that intellectual movement became more and more socialist and less attracted to liberty. And it happened by degrees. But I think classical liberalism kind of devolved into socialism. Liberalism, in the American sense of the term, went from classical liberalism to kind of socialist liberalism or leftism. And then there was always a kind of group or party that was like against whatever the vanguard was for and for what was around previously. So they started being more against socialism because that was the new thing, but they were never particularly pro-freedom. And then people who were pro-freedom were always sort of caught between those two groups and didn't have a natural home. And for a while, when there was a kind of surging leftism in the country, the conservative movement seemed like the bastion of fighting against that. But then when that kind of surging leftism got thwarted to some extent, it no longer was a bastion of that. And I don't know. So I just don't ever think there was that robust a home for pro-market, pro-freedom thinking in the conservative movement to begin with. It was always kind of odd bedfellows that were only partway there and partway embraced by that movement. And the real question is, to me, why hasn't there been a more robust pro-freedom movement that was really about freedom in a way that conservatism never was? And I mean, that's to me the deeper question, and why it hasn't aligned with the political priorities. But I think it has to do with the way there have to be enough people who this is really what animates them for it to become the central political issue. And if it does, the parties would align around that. But it hasn't. And if it had, it would be a real cultural achievement that the issue of freedom versus force came into focus so much in the culture that the parties could be mostly aligned around that.
Are humanities departments in universities falling apart? The enrollment is down a lot.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not in administration. I get to teach some classes and I show up and teach them and there are students there. But I don't know even what's going on so much in the University of Texas where I'm teaching now, much less have national figures on it. I wouldn't be shocked if that's true, but I wouldn't be shocked if it's not. I don't know.
Yep.
I also don't think the humanities are they're different from one another. So philosophy and literature and the critical studies kind of departments, they're different beasts, and I don't know that all the trends, follow the same for all of them.
Let's see. Why has altruism gotten significantly more dominant and entrenched in the culture since Rand's death?
I don't know that it has. I think it was there was a movement towards it that was sort of arrested for a little while, and that's resumed. But it hasn't certainly been on a constant trajectory of increasing since Rand's death. If anything, it was either going down or growing more slowly from.
I think it related to your answer before about 9/11 and all of that. I think it, but yeah, it seems to be getting better for a couple of decades, and then maybe worse,
or at least not getting worse at the same pace. So there was a kind of, I think there's a general intellectual trend for the bad that I think was taking place very, very quickly across the first half of the 20th century, and then sort of broke in the late 60s. And things, remained the same to got a little bit better in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some respects they got worse, but in other respects they got better. And the balance was there wasn't this kind of rocketing towards a bad place. And then in the 2000s, I think it started getting worse again, and really picked up in the 2010s. And I don't know all the reasons for that.
Ivana says, Greg, is there an optimal way to stimulate intellectual activity in a lazy mind? Can one be guided to reason?
In one's own lazy mind or someone else's? Is this self-help? I find that I'm incurious and I want to
think it's self-help
myself, or these people around me. How do I get them thinking? I don't. I would have different answers to each if I could come up with answers. But I think sparking questions, and questions that maybe they start as challenges to something you've assumed, maybe they don't, but get to the point where the question isn't about, is this true or false? But just, like, what's true here? I don't like, you start off with, is Israel right or the Palestinians right in this conflict? And you're trying to defend one side or the other, but get it to the question of like, well, how did this state of affairs start? And how should one start a country? And if one's in a place where another country has been started, but you're not part of it, or you're not welcome in it, or you've been displaced or something, how should you deal with that? Like, once you're thinking about a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer, and you're trying to find the answer, you can just get interested in the questions. And I think for any particular person, including for yourself, you have to kind of notice what types of questions pique my interest. Mm-hmm. But once you get into the habit of kind of following up a question and exploring it and having some sense of what it's like to really know something and to do the work involved in knowing it and thinking about it, hopefully you develop a taste for that. And if anything, it serves as a model to you for like what it's like to really think about something. So even if you don't do that much of it, you can differentiate the times when you've done that from other times and think about, well, that's what real thinking is. And this is just, having a hunch.
All right. What's your opinion on Oregon's drug decriminalization plan not going as planned? They are soon to scrap the project and start to criminalize again.
I haven't been following it, so I don't know much about it. Yaron, do you?
It didn't reduce drug use. It's created a lot of problems because there are a lot of drug addicted people around. I think this is one of those things where, first of all, decriminalizing is not the same as making it legal, which is a big deal because you still have the risk and the violence associated with something that is in a black market, and therefore all the problems that engenders, and the cost and all of that is associated with that. So it's not legalization, which is a big difference. And second, when you don't have property rights, or you don't have an application of property rights, an application of rule of law where law is appropriate, like for property, people can abuse these kind of things. So they consume drugs, they hang out in places where they shouldn't be. They're allowed to hang out. The police doesn't enforce trespass laws. They don't enforce any of these things, and it creates real problems. It's part of the challenge of doing half measures. And while, in a sense, moving towards freedom will do a lot of half measures, how you do those half measures requires real thought, and it's not obvious. You deregulate medicine. Where do you start? Right? There might be things, if you start there, you might do more harm than good. Right? Yeah. And certainly in banking, I can tell you that that's the case, right? If you're going to do banking, you have to do it really, really smart and really, really thoughtful, and thinking about all the consequences of every step that you take. It's not easy to unwind a statist program, and that includes drugs. And I wouldn't start with drugs. That isn't the first statist program I would get rid of. Or if I did, the first part of it would be to free up the police from enforcing the laws, for enforcing it. And get rid of the incentive to take on the kind of risk that cartels take on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of thought in how you unwind an unfree system.
Yep.
And part of it is you have to have a kind of double thinking that you're doing. Like, ultimately, there shouldn't be economic policy at all. Yep. And there should be nothing we're measuring and adjusting our government policy so that the economy does this or that. And there shouldn't be drug policy and etc. But there is. And you have to come up with some steps on the way to freeing it up. And you have to do some kind of measuring to know if those steps are, helping with respect to certain measures or making them worse on the way there. But you also have to know that what you're not trying to manage the economy in a different way. You're trying to ease up on the managing that you've been doing. So it's the one thing if it's drugs, if it's another if it's finance or whatever. So it's hard, and it's a real art, and it requires a lot of people who've thought a lot about this, who know how to do it. And legislation and governance is not, it's a science. It's something that requires work and thought, and it's not, like you know the principle of individual rights, and so you know just what the law should be tomorrow in every place. There's real thinking that has to be done, and it can be done better or worse. And I haven't followed Oregon, and I don't know whether this was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think there's similar problems in places in Europe that have decriminalized drugs, and it's not going exactly according to the way the libertarians would have thought it would go. All right, so the rest of the questions I can take care of.
And I think I really
anyway, and you're like half an hour late, so I will let you go. Thanks, Greg.
I'll listen later, and thanks again for having me on. Everyone, just remember, if tune in to if you're online to Desocializing American Medicine. Saturday, we're going to be on from 10 to 6 Central Time. There's a link to the YouTube on the event page on the Salem Center's page. And if you're here in Austin, come out. We're going to be at Rolling Hall on campus again from 10 to 6. So
that's great. And the link to the Salem Center is below in the description, so you can find it there and go straight to the event page.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Greg. Okay.
Bye, Yaron.
All right, let's do these quickly. Liam says, in England, if you suggest fully privatized NHS, you may be met with violence. I just did a debate in England on privatizing the NHS, getting rid of it. It went fine. There was no violence. It was a small group, granted, but I did debate a former member of British Parliament, an advisor to former Prime Minister, but no violence in this occasion. But yes, they definitely view it as a religion. Mary Aline says, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's description in Infidel of how she made the intellectual journey to atheism was magnificent. I am heartbroken. I am with you, Mary Aline. Clark says, Yaron, when is your interview with Yeonmi Park? I still don't know. I don't have that nailed down. We'll work on it going into the next year. Savannah says, I've read The Fountainhead. I guess I didn't integrate that scene enough. There's plenty of reasons to read The Fountainhead again. There's so much there that people don't notice the first time. Stringer Bell 31, black pill is the scorched earth attitude one gets after transitioning from blue pill to red pill. All right. So I don't know what comes after black pill. Is there a white pill that frees you from all the scorched earth, everything, and liberates your mind to actually see the world as it is? Clark says, when is your debate with Dennis Kucinich? My debate with Kucinich is on November 28th. That's a Tuesday in the evening. I think it's 7:30 East Coast time. I think it's going to be live streamed. Once I have the link and the details, I will, of course, let you know. And of course, once I get a recording, I'll put it up on my website. But it is going to be live streamed. It's not going to be in front of a live audience, I don't think. It's going to be in West Palm Beach in a studio, moderated by, I'm not even sure whom, but moderated. And yeah, it should be interesting. And look forward to doing that. So that's in exactly 2 weeks from tomorrow. All right, I think that's a wrap. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to all the super chatters. Thanks for all your questions. Thank you to Greg for joining us and Amish as well. I hope